Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The analysis paradox. Philosophy has long been concerned with analysis, with taking complex concepts and breaking them down into simpler components, with providing definitions that specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a term, and this project of conceptual analysis seems both important and straightforward. We want to know what knowledge is, what justice is, what truth is, and we proceed by analysing these concepts, by stating explicitly what they mean, by giving definitions that capture their essential features. Yet there is a paradox lurking here, a puzzle about whether analysis is even possible. And this is the paradox of analysis, first articulated clearly by C.H. Langford, and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore and others in the early 20th century. The paradox can be stated simply. Suppose we offer an analysis of some concept. For example, we might analyse the concept brother as male sibling, and this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what brotherhood consists in, should illuminate the concept by making its structure explicit. But if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning. They must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect. It would not capture what brotherhood really is. And if they are synonymous, then the statement brother means male sibling should be trivial, should be like saying brother means brother, a mere tautology that provides no new information. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. And if it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. The paradox threatens the entire project of conceptual analysis, because it suggests that analysis cannot do what it is supposed to do, cannot both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that meaning, cannot be both true and interesting. And so either conceptual analysis is impossible, or our understanding of what analysis is and what it aims to achieve must be revised. One response to the paradox distinguishes between sense and reference, between the meaning of a term and what it picks out, and argues that an analysis can be informative even if the analysandum and analysans refer to the same thing, because they can differ in sense, in the way they present or describe that thing. And so the analysis brother means male sibling is informative, because even though brother and male sibling refer to the same set of individuals, they present that set in different ways, one as a family relation and the other as a combination of gender and kinship. And this difference in sense makes the identity statement informative rather than trivial. Another response appeals to a distinction between conceptual and factual knowledge, arguing that analysis does not provide factual knowledge about the world, but conceptual knowledge about our own concepts, that it makes explicit what was already implicit in our understanding, that it brings to consciousness the structure of concepts that we already possess and use, but have not fully articulated. And so, the informativeness of analysis is not the informativeness of discovering new facts, but the informativeness of self-clarification, of making our own conceptual commitments explicit and transparent. A third response, associated with Quine and others skeptical of the analytic-synthetic distinction, denies that there is a sharp line between conceptual analysis and empirical investigation, arguing that all beliefs form a holistic web where conceptual revisions and factual discoveries are intertwined, and that what we call analysis is really just careful reflection on our current best theory of the world, subject to revision in light of new evidence or theoretical considerations. And on this view, the paradox dissolves, because analysis is not supposed to be a priori or purely conceptual, but is continuous with empirical inquiry, and so it can be both correct and informative without any mystery. The paradox also raises questions about the methodology of philosophy, about whether philosophy can make progress through analysis or whether some other method is needed. And different philosophical traditions have taken different stances, with analytic philosophy traditionally emphasizing conceptual analysis as a central tool, while continental philosophy has been more skeptical of analysis, focusing instead on interpretation, critique, and phenomenological description. And the paradox of analysis has been one factor driving some philosophers away from traditional analysis toward other approaches. The paradox connects to issues about understanding and competence, because we seem to have a kind of implicit or tacit understanding of concepts like knowledge, justice, and truth. We can use these concepts correctly, can apply them to particular cases, can recognize when they are used inappropriately, and yet when asked to state explicitly what these concepts mean, to provide a definition, we struggle. And this suggests that conceptual competence does not require explicit knowledge of definitions, that understanding can be practical and procedural rather than theoretical and propositional, and that analysis attempts to convert implicit understanding into explicit knowledge, a conversion that is difficult and perhaps impossible to complete without remainder. The paradox also appears in the context of philosophical disagreement, because philosophers have been offering analyses of key concepts for millennia, and yet consensus remains elusive. Different philosophers provide different analyses of knowledge, of justice, of truth, and it is not always clear how to adjudicate between competing analyses, whether by appeal to intuitions about particular cases, by considerations of theoretical simplicity and fruitfulness, or by some other standard. And the lack of agreement raises the question of whether these concepts have determinate meanings that analysis can discover, or whether they are vague, contested, or essentially contested, such that no single analysis could capture all the ways they are legitimately used. The analysis paradox remains a puzzle at the heart of philosophy, a question about what philosophy is doing when it offers definitions and analyses, whether it is discovering pre-existing meanings, stipulating new ones, or engaging in some more complex activity that combines elements of discovery, stipulation, and rational reconstruction, and the paradox has not been definitively resolved. Different philosophers find different responses more or less compelling, and the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the nature and methods of philosophical inquiry. And the concept sits there, waiting to be analysed, inviting us to state its essence, to specify its conditions, to make explicit what we already implicitly know, and yet the analysis, when offered, seems either to tell us nothing new or to change the subject, to offer a different concept rather than clarifying the original one. And the paradox persists, a thorn in the side of analysis, a reminder that understanding is more elusive than it appears, that the gap between knowing how to use a concept and knowing what it means is wider than we thought, and that philosophy, despite its ancient commitment to clarity and definition, to making the implicit explicit and the confused clear, may be chasing a goal that is inherently problematic, inherently paradoxical, a goal that recedes as we approach it, that becomes more obscure the more we try to illuminate it, and yet we continue to analyse, to offer definitions, to seek clarity, because the alternative, giving up on understanding, seems worse. The barber paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows a single rule. He shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. And this rule seems simple enough until the question emerges: does the barber shave himself? And suddenly the logic collapses into contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means, according to the rule, he should not shave himself because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves. Which means, according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the loop tightens without escape, spinning endlessly between two impossible options. Bertrand Russell popularized this version of his own paradox as a way to make the abstract problem of self-referential sets more accessible, more human, more vivid, because a barber is easier to imagine than a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Yet the logical structure remains identical, a rule that turns inward and devours its own coherence. The paradox reveals something unsettling about definitions and categories, that not all rules can be consistently applied, that language and logic can conspire to create situations that seem perfectly reasonable until examined closely, and then they shatter. Some philosophers argue that the barber simply cannot exist, that the rule itself is contradictory, and therefore no such barber could ever follow it in reality, while others suggest that the problem lies in assuming the rule must apply universally, that perhaps the barber is exempt from his own rule, or that the village contains no barber at all. The paradox also exposes the danger of self-reference, the way that statements or rules that loop back on themselves can generate infinite regress or outright contradiction. And this has implications far beyond barbershops, touching mathematics, computer science, law, and any system that attempts to regulate itself from within. In set theory, the barber paradox mirrors Russell's discovery that naive set theory permits the construction of sets that cannot exist without contradiction, forcing mathematicians to impose restrictions on which sets are allowed to form, creating hierarchies and boundaries to prevent self-reference from poisoning the system. The barber stands at the edge of reason, a figure trapped in a loop of his own making, unable to shave or not shave without violating the very rule that defines his existence, and in this way, he becomes a symbol of the limits of logic, a reminder that not every question has an answer, that some problems resist resolution no matter how carefully they are examined. The paradox lingers in the mind, a simple story about a man and a razor that somehow reveals a crack in the foundation of thought itself, and once noticed, it cannot be ignored, appearing again and again wherever rules turn inward, wherever systems attempt to contain themselves, wherever language reaches the boundary of what it can coherently express. The blind sight paradox. Why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience, and the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field, and vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them, and the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness, whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience, and experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, "I don't know, I can't see anything there." And the experimenter says, "Just guess. Point to where you think it is," and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. Says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components: conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious. And damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behavior, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight, they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness. Theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience, and this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity. And the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential, and this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blindsight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses, and these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing. And this response denies the complete dissociation, argues that some phenomenology remains in blind sight even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes, and blind sight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blind sight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blind sight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing, feel nothing, experience nothing in that region. And yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior. And the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology. And the blind sight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research. A real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways. And the blind sight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false, and now the contradiction is complete. A perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims, but if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false. and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break. The crocodile dilemma, when a monster's promise makes truth deadly. A crocodile seizes a child from the riverbank, snatches the infant in its jaws, and the mother screams and begs for her child's return, and the crocodile, cunning and cruel, makes an offer. The crocodile says, "I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do, if you say truly whether I will return the child or not." And the mother must choose, must predict the crocodile's action, and if she predicts correctly, she gets her child back. And if she predicts incorrectly, the crocodile keeps the child. And this seems straightforward at first, seems like a gamble with 50-50 odds. But the mother is clever, thinks carefully, and realizes she can construct a prediction that creates a paradox. And she says to the crocodile, "You will not return my child." And now the crocodile faces an impossible choice, a logical trap from which there is no escape. And this is the crocodile dilemma, an ancient paradox from Greek and Roman philosophy that illustrates how self-reference and promises can generate contradictions that have no resolution. Imagine the crocodile processing the mother's prediction. She has said, the crocodile will not return the child, and the crocodile must decide whether this prediction is true or false. And if the prediction is true, then the crocodile will not return the child, but the promise was to return the child. If the prediction is correct, and the prediction is correct, so the crocodile must return the child. But returning the child makes the prediction false, because the prediction said the child would not be returned. And if the prediction is false, then the crocodile is not obligated to return the child, but not returning the child makes the prediction true. And if it is true, the crocodile must return the child, and the cycle repeats. And the crocodile is stuck, unable to act, unable to fulfill the promise without violating it, unable to violate it without fulfilling it, and the paradox is complete. Visualize the crocodile frozen at the water's edge, jaws clamped around the child, mind caught in a logical loop, every option leading to contradiction, and the mother waits, and the crocodile cannot move forward or backward, cannot return the child or keep the child without creating impossibility. and the promise that seemed simple, seemed like a straightforward conditional, has become a trap, has revealed that some promises are unkeepable, some conditionals are incoherent when their conditions refer to their own fulfillment. The dilemma is structurally similar to the liar paradox, involves self-reference creating contradiction, because the mother's prediction refers to the crocodile's action, and the crocodile's action depends on whether the prediction is true, and the prediction's truth depends on the action. And this circular dependency creates a situation where no consistent assignment of truth values is possible, where any choice by the crocodile contradicts the conditions of the promise. And the paradox shows that not all promises can be kept, not all conditionals can be satisfied, especially when the condition refers to the action that depends on the condition. One proposed resolution is that the crocodile's promise is defective, is not a genuine promise, but a linguistic trick, because promises must be performable, must create obligations that can be fulfilled, and the crocodile's promise creates an obligation that cannot be fulfilled when the mother makes the strategic prediction, and so the promise is void. The crocodile is not bound by it, and the crocodile can do whatever it chooses without violating any obligation, and by this resolution, the crocodile keeps the child, the mother loses. Not because her prediction was wrong, but because she made a prediction that made the promise unenforceable, and the dilemma is resolved by rejecting the premise that the promise binds the crocodile in paradoxical cases. Another resolution distinguishes between the crocodile's intentions at the moment of making the promise and the actual outcome, and argues that the promise should be interpreted as concerning the crocodile's intended action, not the final action after considering the prediction, and when the mother predicts the child will not be returned, the crocodile evaluates whether to intend to return the child, and if the crocodile's initial intention is not to return the child, then the prediction is correct, and the crocodile should return the child according to the promise. And this return action does not create a contradiction, because the promise was about the intention, not about the final action. But this resolution seems strained, seems to reinterpret the promise in ways that were not clearly intended. And it is not obvious that distinguishing intention from action resolves the paradox or merely shifts it. A third resolution embraces the paradox and argues that it shows the limits of what can be promised, that some conditionals are inherently problematic, that promises whose conditions involve self-reference or depend on the promiser's response to the condition create logical tangles that cannot be resolved, and rational agents should avoid making such promises, should recognize that not every grammatically well-formed conditional statement creates a genuine obligation, and the crocodile's mistake was offering a promise whose structure allowed paradoxical predictions. And once the paradox emerges, the crocodile is released from the promise, is in a situation where any action is permissible because no action can satisfy the promise, and morality and logic give no guidance. The crocodile dilemma also illustrates issues in game theory and strategic reasoning, because the mother is using her prediction strategically, choosing her words not to convey her genuine belief about what the crocodile will do, but to create a situation where the crocodile cannot win. And this strategic use of language, using predictions not to predict, but to constrain, appears in negotiations, legal arguments, and political discourse, where statements are crafted to create binds, to force opponents into positions where any response is disadvantageous, and the dilemma shows that self-referential statements can be weapons, can be used to trap others in paradoxes where no good option exists. The dilemma has modern variants involving computers and artificial intelligence, where programs might be given instructions that are self-referential, that depend on the program's own output in ways that create paradox, and programmers must be careful to avoid such loops, must ensure that conditionals do not refer to their own evaluation in ways that create infinite regress or contradiction. And the crocodile dilemma serves as a warning, a reminder that self-reference is dangerous, creates problems that cannot always be resolved by cleverness or by trying harder, but only by recognizing the structure and avoiding it. The child hangs in the crocodile's jaws. The mother waits for an answer, and the crocodile is paralyzed by logic, cannot move without contradiction, and the ancient paradox remains, unsolved, unresolvable, a trap that philosophy has not escaped, a reminder that language can create impossibilities, that promises can be unkeepable, that self-reference generates paradoxes that defy solution, and the crocodile dilemma endures, taught in logic classes, discussed in philosophy seminars, a vivid example of how words can bind more tightly than chains, how a simple promise can become an impossible obligation, and how the combination of self-reference and conditionality creates contradictions from which there is no escape, and the crocodile remains frozen, the child unclaimed, and the paradox persists, waiting at the riverbank for the next clever victim to spring the trap. The Euthyphro dilemma. Is murder wrong because God says so, or does God say so because it's wrong? In ancient Athens, a young man named Euthyphro encounters Socrates on the steps of the courthouse, and Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder. And Socrates, ever curious, asks Euthyphro to explain what piety is. What makes an action holy or righteous? And Euthyphro confidently responds that pious actions are those loved by the gods, and impious actions are those hated by the gods. And Socrates, never satisfied with simple answers, poses a question that has echoed through philosophy and theology for over 2,000 years. He asks whether the gods love pious actions because those actions are pious, or whether actions are pious because the gods love them. And this question, now called the Euthyphro dilemma, presents a fundamental challenge to divine command theory. The view that morality depends on God's will, that actions are right or wrong because God commands or forbids them, and the dilemma forces a choice between two uncomfortable options, each with troubling implications for the relationship between God and morality. Imagine the first horn of the dilemma. Suppose that actions are good because God commands them, that rightness is simply whatever God says is right, and wrongness is whatever God forbids, and there is no independent standard of goodness, no morality that exists prior to or apart from God's commands, and God could have commanded anything, could have made murder obligatory and charity forbidden, could have declared torture virtuous and compassion wicked, and whatever God commanded would be right by definition. And this seems to make morality arbitrary, seems to empty moral terms of their content. Because if good just means commanded by God, then saying God commands what is good becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying God commands what God commands, which is trivial, tells us nothing, and more troublingly, this view seems to undermine the idea that God is good, because if goodness is defined by God's commands, then calling God good just means God does what God commands, which again is trivial, and we lose the ability to praise God's goodness as something meaningful, as something that transcends mere consistency with divine will. Visualize a world where this view is true, where morality is purely a matter of divine fiat, and God announces new commandments, declares that from now on, stealing is virtuous and honesty is sin, and according to divine command theory, this announcement would make stealing right and honesty wrong, because rightness just is whatever God says, and we would be obligated to become thieves, obligated to lie. And this seems absurd, seems to violate our deepest moral intuitions, because we feel that stealing and lying are wrong for reasons that have nothing to do with commands, that they harm people, violate trust, undermine cooperation, and these reasons would exist even if God commanded otherwise, and so morality seems to have a structure, a logic that cannot be altered by divine decree. And this suggests that the first horn of the dilemma is unacceptable, that we should reject the idea that actions are good merely because God commands them. Now consider the second horn. Suppose that God commands actions because those actions are good, that there is an independent standard of goodness, a moral truth that exists prior to God's commands. And God, being perfectly good and perfectly wise, recognizes this moral truth and commands accordingly. And God commands charity because charity is good, forbids murder because murder is bad, and the goodness and badness exist independently of the commands. And this seems more plausible, seems to preserve the meaningfulness of moral language and the praiseworthiness of God's goodness. But it creates a different problem, because if moral truth is independent of God, then God is not the ultimate source of morality. God does not create right and wrong, but merely recognizes and reveals them. And there is something above God, a standard of goodness to which even God is subject. And this seems to limit God's sovereignty, seems to place constraints on divine power and authority. And many theologians find this unacceptable, argue that nothing can be above God, that God is the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, and making morality independent of God seems to dethrone God, to reduce God to a mere messenger of moral truths that exist on their own. The dilemma presents a forced choice: either accept that morality is arbitrary, dependent on God's will, capable of being anything God decrees, or accept that morality is independent of God, existing prior to divine commands, limiting God's sovereignty. And neither option is attractive to believers who want to say both that God is the source of morality and that God's commands reflect genuine moral truth rather than arbitrary preference. And various theological and philosophical responses have been proposed over the centuries, attempting to escape between the horns to find a position that preserves both divine sovereignty and moral objectivity. One response associated with medieval theologians like Duns Scotus embraces the first horn, accepts that morality depends entirely on God's will, and bites the bullet on arbitrariness, arguing that God's commands are not arbitrary in any problematic sense because God is perfectly rational and benevolent. And while God could have commanded otherwise, God would never do so. And God's nature ensures that divine commands will align with what promotes flourishing and well-being. And so while morality is ultimately grounded in God's will, it is not random or capricious. And this response tries to have it both ways, tries to say that morality depends on God's will, but is still stable and reasonable because God's character is stable and reasonable. But critics argue that this just pushes the problem back, because now we are saying God's character is good. And what does good mean here? If goodness is defined by God's will, then saying God's character is good is circular. And if goodness is independent, then we are back on the second horn. Another response associated with Aquinas and natural law theory embraces the second horn but softens it, argues that moral truth is not independent of God but is part of God's nature, is rooted in the divine essence, and God's commands reflect God's eternal nature rather than arbitrary choices. And goodness is not external to God but internal, is what God is, and God commands what is good because God is goodness itself. And this unites God and morality, makes them inseparable, avoids both arbitrariness and external constraint. But critics argue that this is just wordplay, that if moral truth is part of God's nature, then it is still independent in the relevant sense, still not something God creates or controls, and the question remains whether God could have had a different nature. And if so, we are back to arbitrariness. And if not, then something constrains God's nature, something makes God's nature what it is, and we are back to external constraints. A third response from some modern philosophers rejects the dilemma entirely, argues that it presents a false choice, that it assumes moral realism, assumes that moral truths exist objectively, either dependent on God or independent. But perhaps moral truth is neither. Perhaps morality is a human construction, a set of norms we create to facilitate cooperation, and God's role is to guide this construction, to reveal which norms best serve human flourishing, and this avoids both horns by denying the assumption that moral truth exists in any absolute sense. But it creates new problems, makes morality relative or subjective, undermines the claim that moral truths are objective facts that God knows and humans can discover, and many find this solution worse than the original dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma appears not just in theology, but in secular ethics as well, because any attempt to ground morality in authority faces the same structure. If we say actions are right because society approves them, we can ask whether society approves them because they are right, or whether they are right because society approves them. And the dilemma recurs: arbitrariness on one side, independent moral truth on the other, and the same choice must be faced. And this suggests that the dilemma is not specifically about God, but about the relationship between authority and morality, about whether moral truth can be grounded in will, in decision, in command, or whether it must exist independently of any authority, answerable to reason or nature or some other source. Socrates stands on the courthouse steps, questioning Euthyphro, probing the foundations of piety, and the young man's confidence wavers. His simple answer unravels, and the dilemma emerges, stark and unavoidable. And 25 centuries later, the question remains: does God command the good because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? And theologians and philosophers continue to debate, continue to propose solutions, continue to struggle with a choice that seems to force a sacrifice: either God's sovereignty or morality's objectivity, either divine authority or moral truth. And the dilemma persists, unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a challenge to anyone who wants to ground ethics in divine will, and a reminder that even the most fundamental questions about the source of right and wrong, about the relationship between God and goodness, about whether morality is created or discovered, remain open, remain contested. And the young Euthyphro walks away confused, and Socrates continues to question, and the dilemma remains, waiting to challenge every new generation of believers and philosophers who confront the ancient problem of how God and morality relate. The fixity of the past, why yesterday traps today. A philosopher asserts a principle that seems undeniable, seems like one of the most obvious truths about time, and the principle is that the past is fixed, is unchangeable, is beyond our power to affect, and what has happened, cannot be made not to have happened, and no one can change the past, can reach back through time to alter what occurred. And this fixity of the past seems like a fundamental constraint on agency, seems to limit what we can do, and yet this apparently obvious principle creates puzzles when combined with other beliefs about causation and freedom. Because if the past is fixed, and if determinism is true, then the present is also fixed, is determined by the past, and if the present is fixed, then our actions are fixed, are not up to us, are not within our control. And the fixity of the past combined with determinism leads to the conclusion that we are not free, that everything we do was already settled by factors beyond our control. And this is the fixity of the past problem, the puzzle about how the unchangeability of the past constrains present freedom, about whether fixity transfers from past to present under determinism, about whether we can have power over facts that are determined by fixed facts. And this problem is closely related to the consequence argument and the transfer principle, and resolves in similar ways, with compatibilists denying that fixity transfers and incompatibilists insisting that it does, and the fixity of the past stands as another battleground in the free will debate. Imagine the past as a vast record, every event that has ever occurred inscribed permanently, unchangeably, and this record determines, through the laws of nature, everything that will occur, everything you will do. And the record was written before you were born, was fixed billions of years ago when the universe began, and you came into existence within a universe whose future was already determined by its past, and nothing you can do can change that record, can alter what has already happened. And so nothing you can do can alter what will happen, because what will happen is fixed by what has happened. and the fixity of the past extends forward through deterministic causation to create fixity of the future. And if the future is fixed, then freedom is impossible. Then your actions are not up to you, are not within your power, are settled independently of your will. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to show that determinism plus fixity of past equals no freedom. The fixity of the past can be formulated as a principle. For any fact about the past, no one has power over whether that fact obtained. No one can make it the case that the past was different from how it actually was, and this principle is sometimes called the necessity of the past. Though necessity is a confusing term here because the past is not logically necessary, is not necessary in all possible worlds, but is only fixed in the sense that we cannot change it, cannot affect it retroactively, and the past is settled, is beyond our control, and this settledness seems to spread forward under determinism, seems to make the present also settled, also beyond our control, and freedom disappears, is eliminated by the fixity of the past combined with deterministic causation. Visualize time as a line. The past extends behind, fixed and unchangeable, and the present is the moving point, and the future extends ahead. And if determinism is true, then the future is just as determined as the past is settled by past plus laws. And the only difference between past and future is epistemic. We know the past and do not know the future, but metaphysically they are equivalent, both determined, both fixed, and if we lack power over the past, then we also lack power over the future, because the future is determined by the past, and power does not extend across determination. And so the fixity of the past proves that determinism eliminates freedom. Compatibilists respond to fixity arguments in various ways. One response distinguishes between two kinds of fixity: what is fixed in the sense of being unchangeable retroactively, and what is fixed in the sense of being determined, and argues that while the past is fixed in the first sense, we have no power to go back and change it. The present is not fixed in the first sense, is not in the past, and our current actions determine what the present is. And so we have power over the present, even though we lack power over the past. And the two kinds of fixity are different. And the fixity of the past does not transfer to the present in the way incompatibilists claim. Another compatibilist response appeals to counterfactual power, argues that even though the past is fixed, we have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, is what matters for responsibility, and the fixity of the past is compatible with our having counterfactual power over the present. And so determinism does not eliminate freedom, and the fixity of the past does not transfer to the present in any sense that threatens freedom. A third compatibilist response accepts that the past is fixed but denies that determinism makes the present fixed in any problematic sense, argues that being determined by the past is not the same as being beyond our control, that our choices are part of the causal chain from past to present, are among the factors that determine what happens, and having our choices be determining factors is what control consists in, is what makes actions up to us. And the fixity of the past is irrelevant, because what matters is not whether the past could have been different, but whether our current choices make a difference. And they do. They determine outcomes. And this is sufficient for freedom. Incompatibilists reject these compatibilist responses, argue that they involve verbal tricks, equivocations on power and control that obscure the real issue. And the real issue is that if the past is fixed and determines the present, then the present is also fixed, is not genuinely open, is not within our control in any sense that matters for responsibility, and compatibilist power is not real power, is a redefinition designed to make freedom compatible with determinism, and the fixity of the past, properly understood, shows that determinism eliminates genuine freedom, eliminates the kind of control required for moral responsibility. The fixity of the past also raises questions about time travel, about whether it is possible to change the past, and most philosophers accept that backward causation is impossible, that we cannot travel back and alter what occurred, because this would create paradoxes, would make it possible for you to prevent your own birth by killing your grandfather before your parents met. And such paradoxes show that the past must be fixed, must be immune to retroactive alteration. But some philosophers argue that time travel is possible as long as it is consistent, as long as any effects you have in the past are already part of the past, as it actually occurred. And this allows time travel without paradox, but requires giving up the idea that you could change the past, could make it different. And this reinforces the fixity of the past, shows that even time travel does not give power over the past. The past sits behind us, vast and unchangeable, every event recorded, every cause set in motion, and the causal chains extend from past to present, determine what is happening now, determine what you're doing, and the fixity of the past. The unchangeability of what has happened seems to make your present action also unchangeable, also fixed, also beyond your control, because if the past could not have been different, and if the past determines the present, then the present could not have been different, and you could not have done otherwise. And freedom is lost, is eliminated by the combination of fixity and determinism. And the fixity of the past remains a central problem for compatibilism, remains a challenge to explain how we can be free if our actions are determined by a past we cannot change. And the answers compatibilists offer remain controversial, remain rejected by incompatibilists who insist that fixity transfers, that unchangeability spreads from past to present under determinism, and the fixity of the past endures as a fundamental constraint on agency, a feature of time that shapes what we can and cannot do. And whether this feature eliminates freedom or merely defines its boundaries remains one of the central questions in philosophy of free will. The Galileo paradox. Galileo Galilei, in his final work Discorsi e dimostrazioni matematiche, presented a paradox about infinite quantities that anticipates later discoveries in set theory and challenges intuitions about size and comparison. And the paradox concerns the relationship between the natural numbers and the perfect squares, and Galileo observed that every natural number has a unique perfect square, obtained by multiplying the number by itself. And conversely, every perfect square corresponds to a unique natural number, its square root. And so there is a one-to-one correspondence between the natural numbers and the perfect squares, suggesting that there are just as many perfect squares as natural numbers, and yet the perfect squares are a proper subset of the natural numbers. Most numbers are not perfect squares. 1 is a square, 2 is not, 3 is not, 4 is a square, 5 is not, and so on, with squares becoming increasingly sparse as numbers grow larger. And this suggests that there are fewer perfect squares than natural numbers. And so Galileo's paradox is that the perfect squares seem to be both equal in number to the natural numbers by virtue of the one-to-one correspondence, and fewer in number by virtue of being a proper subset. And these two conclusions contradict each other, or seem to. And Galileo concluded that the concepts of equal, greater, and less do not apply to infinite quantities, that infinity transcends these comparisons, that we cannot meaningfully say that one infinite collection is larger or smaller than another. The paradox remained unresolved for centuries until the development of set theory by Georg Cantor in the late 19th century, and Cantor provided a systematic way to compare infinite sets, defining two sets to have the same cardinality if there exists a one-to-one correspondence between them, a bijection that pairs each element of one set with a unique element of the other. And under this definition, the natural numbers and the perfect squares have the same cardinality. Both are countably infinite. Both can be enumerated in a sequence, and the fact that the perfect squares are a proper subset of the natural numbers does not imply that they have a smaller cardinality, because infinite sets can be placed in one-to-one correspondence with proper subsets of themselves. And this property, far from being a contradiction or paradox, is the defining characteristic of infinite sets. The feature that distinguishes them from finite sets, where proper subsets always have strictly smaller cardinality. Cantor went further, showing that not all infinite sets have the same cardinality, that there is a hierarchy of infinities, that the set of real numbers is uncountably infinite, larger in a precise technical sense than the set of natural numbers. And this hierarchy extends infinitely upward, each level of infinity giving rise to larger infinities through power set constructions. And so, while Galileo's paradox shows that some infinite sets are equal in size despite one being a proper subset of the other, it does not follow that all infinite sets are equal, and the study of different sizes of infinity, of cardinal arithmetic, became a central part of set theory and mathematical logic. Galileo's paradox also raises philosophical questions about the nature of mathematical objects and the applicability of mathematics to the physical world, because if infinite sets have properties that violate finite intuitions, if the part can be equal to the whole when infinity is involved, then perhaps infinite quantities are not genuine quantities at all, but merely symbolic manipulations, mathematical fictions useful for certain purposes, but not corresponding to anything real. And this nominalist or instrumentalist view treats infinity as a convenient idealization rather than a description of actual totalities, and it sidesteps the paradox by denying that infinite collections exist, and so the paradox has no physical significance. It is merely an artifact of extending finite concepts beyond their proper domain. Others embrace the reality of infinite sets, arguing that mathematical objects exist independently of physical instantiation, that the natural numbers and the real numbers are abstract entities with determinate properties, and that Galileo's paradox reveals not a flaw in mathematics, but a truth about infinity, that infinite collections behave differently from finite collections, and that our intuitions, shaped by experience with finite quantities, must be revised when dealing with infinity. And this revision is not a retreat or a compromise, but an expansion of understanding, a recognition that reality, whether mathematical or physical, is richer and stranger than common sense suggests. The paradox also appears in physics and cosmology, in discussions of whether the universe is spatially infinite, whether it contains infinitely many galaxies, infinitely many stars, infinitely many particles, and if so, whether these infinities can be compared, whether one infinite quantity is larger than another, and whether operations like addition or subtraction are well defined for infinite quantities. And these questions do not have obvious answers. They depend on the mathematical framework used to describe the universe, on assumptions about the structure of space-time, and on whether infinite sets in mathematics correspond to infinite collections in reality. Galileo's paradox was one of the first systematic explorations of infinity, one of the first attempts to rigorously analyze what it means for a collection to be infinite, and it anticipated many of the insights that would later be formalized in set theory, and Galileo's conclusion that the usual comparisons of size do not apply to infinite quantities was both right and wrong. Wrong in that infinite sets can be compared, and some are larger than others, but right in that infinite sets do not obey the same rules as finite sets, that the part can be equal to the whole, that addition and subtraction of infinite quantities are not straightforward, and that intuition trained on finite examples is an unreliable guide. The numbers stretch to infinity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and among them the perfect squares, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, sparse but infinite. And the correspondence exists, each number paired with its square, each square paired with its root, and the two collections, one a subset of the other, are equal in cardinality, equal in size, And this equality, which seems to contradict the part being smaller than the whole, is not a contradiction, but a truth about infinity, a revelation that the infinite is qualitatively different from the finite, that the rules change when quantities are unbounded, and Galileo's paradox remains a landmark, the first clear formulation of the strange properties of infinite sets, the first hint that infinity would require new mathematics, new concepts, new ways of thinking about quantity and comparison. And the paradox endures, not as a problem to be solved, but as a lesson learned, a demonstration that infinity is not a large number, but a different kind of thing entirely, and that understanding it requires abandoning intuitions that serve us well in the finite realm, but mislead us when we venture into the infinite. The growing argument, Hechir. Objects change size over time. A child grows into an adult, a sapling becomes a tree, a pebble is worn smooth by erosion, and yet we say these are the same entities, the same person, the same tree, the same stone. But if size and shape change, can identity truly remain? And this is the growing argument, sometimes called the growing block paradox, or the problem of material constitution. A puzzle about how objects can gain or lose parts while remaining numerically identical to themselves. Consider a statue made of clay, and a sculptor adds more clay to it, making it larger, and then removes some clay, making it smaller, and at each moment the statue is made of different material, occupying a different volume, and yet we call it the same statue throughout the process. But if the statue is identical to the lump of clay that constitutes it, then the statue and the clay should share all their properties. Yet the statue has properties the clay does not. The statue has aesthetic value. The statue was created at a certain time. The statue could survive minor alterations, while the clay, as a mere lump, has none of these properties. And so the statue and the clay cannot be identical, even though they occupy the same space and are made of the same material. The paradox deepens when we consider the career of the clay. The lump existed before the statue was formed, and will exist after the statue is destroyed, and so the lump and the statue have different temporal boundaries. They begin and end at different times, and if they are not identical, then there must be two objects occupying the same space at the same time, the lump and the statue. And this seems strange, an unnecessary multiplication of entities. Some philosophers embrace this conclusion, arguing that the world contains far more objects than we ordinarily recognize, that every statue is accompanied by a lump, every organism by a mass of cells, every table by a quantity of wood, and that identity is highly context-sensitive, determined by how we carve up the world conceptually, rather than by objective metaphysical facts. Others reject this view, arguing that the statue and the lump are the same object considered under different descriptions, that the properties that seem different are not intrinsic properties, but extrinsic or relational ones, that being a statue is a matter of how the lump is shaped and how it is regarded rather than being a separate object. The growing argument also applies to living organisms. Because a person gains and loses atoms constantly, the body grows from infancy to adulthood, shrinks in old age, yet personal identity persists. And the question arises whether the person is identical to the collection of matter that makes up their body at any given moment. And if not, then what are they? And if so, then how can they survive the replacement of that matter over time? Mereology, the study of parts and wholes, offers various theories to address these puzzles. Some argue that objects are identical if they share all the same parts at the same time, while others allow for gradual replacement, saying that identity can be maintained as long as the changes are continuous and not too drastic. And still others embrace temporal parts, arguing that objects are four-dimensional, with different temporal slices, and that the question of identity over time is really a question of whether those slices are connected in the right way. The growing argument forces confrontation with the question of what objects are, whether they are material lumps, patterns, processes, or conventional designations. Whether identity is absolute or relative, whether the world contains discrete, persistent entities or only a flux of matter temporarily arranged in stable configurations, and whether our language and concepts, which treat objects as enduring individuals, accurately reflect the structure of reality or impose a simplifying grid on something far more fluid and complex. The paradox remains unresolved, a source of ongoing debate in metaphysics, and it reminds us that growth and change, the most ordinary features of existence, conceal profound mysteries about identity, persistence, and the nature of the things that populate our world. The infinite shadow paradox, when your shadow could cover the universe. Imagine standing in a bright room with a light source behind you, casting your shadow on the wall in front of you, and the shadow is roughly your size, perhaps slightly larger, depending on the distance between you and the light. And now imagine moving the light farther and farther away, keeping it directly behind you. And as the light moves back, your shadow grows larger, stretching taller and wider on the wall, because the light rays diverge more gradually, creating a bigger shadow. And if you continue this process, moving the light farther and farther away, your shadow continues to grow. And now the question emerges, what happens if the light source is infinitely far away? If the light comes from an infinite distance, does your shadow become infinitely large? Does it stretch across the entire wall, the entire room, the entire planet, the entire universe? And if so, what does this mean? How can your finite body cast an infinite shadow? And this is the infinite shadow paradox, a thought experiment that reveals tensions between geometry, infinity, and the behavior of light. Consider the geometry more carefully. When the light is close behind you, the light rays that graze the top of your head and the light rays that graze your feet diverge at a large angle, creating a shadow that is only slightly larger than your body. But as the light moves farther away, the angle between these rays decreases. The rays become more nearly parallel, and the shadow grows proportionally. And in the limiting case where the light is infinitely far away, the rays become perfectly parallel, and the shadow, if it still makes sense to talk about a shadow, is no longer a finite shape on a surface, but an infinite column of darkness extending forever in the direction away from the light. And your body blocks a certain solid angle of light, a cone of rays, and when the light is infinitely far away, this cone becomes a cylinder, extending infinitely. And so, in some sense, your shadow has become infinite. It covers an infinite region of space. But there is something strange about this conclusion, because in reality, when light comes from very far away, like sunlight which travels from the sun 93 million miles distant, shadows are sharp and well-defined, not infinite. And the reason is that even though the sun is very far away, it is not infinitely far. And more importantly, the sun is not a point source. It is an extended object, a sphere, and light comes from every point on the sun's surface. And these different light sources create slightly different shadows that overlap. And the overlapping softens the edges and prevents the shadow from extending infinitely. And so the paradox relies on an idealization, a perfectly point-like light source at infinite distance. And this idealization does not correspond to physical reality. And so the infinite shadow is a feature of the idealized model rather than a genuine physical phenomenon. Another way to resolve the paradox is to recognize that the concept of a shadow depends on there being a surface on which the shadow is cast, a wall or a floor or the ground. And if the light is infinitely far away and there is no surface, then there is no shadow in the usual sense. There is a region of space from which light is blocked, but without a surface to project onto. The notion of shadow loses its meaning, and so the infinite shadow is not a shadow at all, but an abstract geometric construction, a cylinder of blocked light extending through space. And whether this deserves to be called a shadow or an infinitely large shadow is a matter of definition rather than a physical fact. The paradox also connects to questions about parallel lines and perspective, because in ordinary experience, parallel lines appear to converge at a vanishing point on the horizon. Train tracks appear to meet in the distance, even though they remain the same distance apart. And this convergence is a feature of perspective, of how our eyes or cameras project three-dimensional space onto two-dimensional images. But in the case of light rays coming from infinity, the rays are truly parallel, not merely appearing parallel, and parallel lines by definition never meet, extend forever without intersecting. And so the shadow, defined as the region blocked by your body from these parallel rays, is a cylinder that extends infinitely. And there is no convergence, no finite boundary. And the paradox is that this seems to make your small body relevant to arbitrarily distant regions of space, seems to give your finite physical presence infinite geometric reach. Some philosophers have used the infinite shadow paradox to argue about the nature of infinity and the limits of physical realizability, suggesting that infinite quantities like infinite distance or infinite extension cannot actually occur in the physical universe, that they are useful mathematical idealizations, but not genuine features of reality. And the paradox supports this view by showing that infinite idealizations lead to strange consequences that do not match experience. And so perhaps infinity is a tool for calculation rather than a description of the actual world. And the paradox is avoided by rejecting the premise that light can come from infinite distance, or that shadows can extend infinitely. Others embrace the paradox as revealing something genuine about geometry and light, accepting that in an idealized geometric setting, with a point source at infinity and parallel rays, shadows do become infinite. And this is not a contradiction, but a feature of how geometry works, and the fact that physical light sources are extended and finite distances are never truly infinite means that the paradox does not apply to real shadows, but it remains a valid thought experiment about what would happen in an idealized limit. And such thought experiments are valuable for understanding the structure of space and the behavior of light, even if they do not correspond to observable phenomena. Visualize yourself standing on an infinite flat plane, with a point of light infinitely far behind you, and the light rays come in perfectly parallel, and your body blocks a cylinder of these rays, and the cylinder extends forward forever. And if there were a wall anywhere in front of you, no matter how far away, your shadow would appear on that wall, and the shadow would be exactly your size, exactly your shape, because the parallel rays preserve size and shape. And so, in this sense, your shadow is not infinitely large, but infinitely long. It is a finite cross-section extended through infinite space. And whether this counts as an infinite shadow or merely an infinitely extended shadow is a question of terminology. But the strangeness remains, the fact that your finite body has infinite geometric influence. The paradox also appears in discussions of cosmology and the nature of the universe, because if the universe is infinite in spatial extent and light travels in straight lines, then in principle, a light source on one side of the universe could cast shadows of objects on the other side, and the time required for light to travel such distances would be infinite. And so the shadow would never actually form, would always be in the process of propagating, and this raises questions about whether infinite distances are meaningful, whether light travelling forever without reaching a destination is different from light that does not exist, and whether geometric constructions that invoke infinity are useful descriptions or merely mathematical artifacts. The shadow stretches forward, grows as the light recedes, and in the limit becomes infinite, a column of darkness extending without end, and you stand there, finite and small, casting a shadow that reaches to infinity. And the paradox asks whether this makes sense, whether infinite shadows are possible, whether geometry allows such things. And the answer depends on what idealizations are accepted, on whether point sources and infinite distances and perfect parallel rays are admitted. And if they are, then the shadow is infinite, and if they are not, then the paradox dissolves, and the paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how infinity changes things, how limits can produce strange results, how geometric reasoning applied to idealized cases can lead to conclusions that violate intuition, and the shadow persists, stretching toward infinity, a monument to the strangeness of geometric idealizations and the care required when reasoning about the infinite. The Noah paradox. There exists a peculiar sentence that seems to lead directly to contradiction, and this sentence states the knower is not known. And the question arises, is this sentence true or false? And both options lead to trouble, creating what is known as the Noah paradox, a puzzle in epistemic logic that reveals tensions between knowledge, truth, and self-reference. Suppose the sentence the knower is not known is true. Then by definition of what the sentence says, the fact that the knower is not known is itself not known. It is a truth that escapes knowledge, but if this is a truth, then it is knowable. There is nothing incoherent about knowing that something is not known. We know many facts of the form. Nobody knows X. We know that nobody knows the exact number of grains of sand on all the Earth's beaches, and so if the knower is not known is true, then someone could know it. But if someone knows it, then they know that the knower is not known, which means the knower, the fact that the knower is not known, is now known. And this contradicts the content of the sentence, which states that this fact is not known. And so assuming the sentence is true leads to contradiction. Suppose instead that the sentence is false, then its negation is true, which means the knower is known, which means someone knows that the knower is not known. But if someone knows this, then the knower, the proposition that the knower is not known, is indeed not known becomes known. And so the sentence is true after all. And again, contradiction emerges. And so neither assuming the sentence is true, nor assuming it is false, leads to a consistent outcome, and the paradox resists resolution through ordinary logical means. The Noah paradox is related to the liar paradox and other self-referential semantic paradoxes, but it involves knowledge rather than truth, and it shows that knowledge, like truth, cannot be fully captured within a single, consistent formal system without restrictions. That self-reference combined with epistemic notions generates instability, and the paradox has implications for epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because standard epistemic logics treat knowledge as a modality, a sentential operator that applies to propositions. And these logics typically assume that knowledge is factive. If you know P, then P is true. And that knowledge is transparent. If you know P, then you know that you know P. And these principles, which seem innocuous, interact with self-reference to produce paradoxes like the knower. One response to the Noah paradox is to restrict self-reference, to prohibit sentences that refer to their own knowability status, much like Tarski's hierarchy of languages prohibits sentences that refer to their own truth. And on this approach, the knower is not known is not a genuine sentence, not a proposition with a truth value, but a piece of ill-formed language that violates the rules of proper semantic construction. And while this response avoids contradiction, it does so at the cost of limiting what can be said, of ruling out sentences that seem grammatically and conceptually well-formed. And it leaves open the question of why these restrictions should be imposed, whether they reflect genuine features of knowledge or are merely technical devices to preserve consistency. Another response distinguishes between levels of knowledge, perhaps first-order knowledge about the world, second-order knowledge about knowledge, third-order knowledge about knowledge of knowledge, and so on, and argues that the knower paradox conflates these levels, that the knower is not known involves a sentence referring to its own knowability at the same level, and that this is illegitimate, that knowledge statements must be stratified into a hierarchy where knowledge at one level can only apply to propositions at lower levels, and this hierarchical approach mirrors solutions to the liar paradox and other semantic paradoxes, but it raises questions about whether ordinary knowledge attributions respect such hierarchies, whether in natural language we freely mix levels of knowledge without contradiction, and whether imposing hierarchies is a genuine solution or merely a way of avoiding the problem. Some philosophers embrace paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions to exist without trivializing the entire system, without forcing the conclusion that everything is true. And in paraconsistent frameworks, the Noah paradox can be true and false simultaneously. The sentence can be both known and not known, and the contradiction is tolerated rather than resolved, contained within the logical system without spreading. And while this approach is radical, it has the advantage of taking the paradox at face value, of not dismissing it as ill-formed or illegitimate, but recognizing it as revealing something genuine about the limits of consistent reasoning about knowledge. The Noah paradox also connects to issues about the closure of knowledge under known entailment. The principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you know Q, because this principle, combined with the factivity of knowledge and certain assumptions about self-knowledge, can be used to derive paradoxes, and some epistemologists have questioned whether closure should be unrestricted, whether there are cases where you know P and know that P entails Q but do not know Q, perhaps because Q is a complicated consequence that you have not worked out, or because Q involves self-referential or paradoxical content that resists knowledge. The paradox raises questions about the transparency of knowledge, the principle that if you know P, then you know that you know P, because this principle, known as the KK principle, is controversial. Some argue that it is too strong, that there are cases where you know something without knowing that you know it, perhaps because you're not introspectively aware of your knowledge, or because the recognition of knowledge requires second-order reflection that you have not performed. And if the KK principle is rejected, then some versions of the Noah paradox may be blocked because the reasoning depends on assumptions about what is knowable given what is known. The Noah paradox sits alongside other epistemic paradoxes, the surprise examination paradox, Fitch's paradox, Moore's paradox, each revealing different tensions in our concepts of knowledge and belief, each challenging the assumption that these concepts can be fully formalized without residue, and together they suggest that knowledge is a more complex and less tractable notion than it appears, that self-reference and knowledge do not mix well, that there are limits to what can be known or consistently said about knowledge, and that the project of epistemic logic, while valuable, must navigate carefully around paradoxes that threaten its foundations. The sentence "the knower is not known" hangs in conceptual space, neither comfortably true nor comfortably false, a knot that logic cannot untie, a puzzle that resists the tools we use to solve puzzles, and it reminds us that language and thought contain traps, that self-reference is dangerous, that some sentences generate contradictions not because they are meaningless, but because they expose the limits of our logical systems, the boundaries where consistency breaks down and paradox takes over, and the Noah paradox remains, a thorn in the side of epistemic logic, a challenge to anyone who claims to understand what knowledge is and how it operates. And the question persists, is the knower known or unknown? And the answer, whatever it is, leads to contradiction, and the paradox endures, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical puzzles, a reminder that even knowledge itself, the concept at the heart of epistemology, contains mysteries that philosophy has not yet fathomed. The liberal paradox, when freedom and choice destroy each other. An economist named Amartya Sen constructs a paradox about individual liberty and social choice, about whether societies can simultaneously respect individual freedom and satisfy basic welfare criteria. And the paradox goes as follows. Suppose society values individual freedom, values the principle that each person should be decisive over certain personal matters, should have sovereignty over a domain of choices, perhaps what to wear or what to read or how to live, and call this principle minimal liberalism, the requirement that each individual has at least one pair of alternatives where their preference determines social choice. And now suppose society also values Pareto efficiency, values the principle that if everyone prefers outcome A to outcome B, then society should choose A, should not choose an outcome that makes everyone worse off. And Sen proves that these two principles are incompatible, that no social decision procedure can guarantee both minimal liberalism and Pareto efficiency, that respecting individual freedom can conflict with respecting unanimous preferences. And this is the liberal paradox, also called the impossibility of a Paretian liberal, a demonstration that liberal values contain internal tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that respecting individual choice over personal matters can lead to outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And the paradox has generated enormous literature, has sparked debates about the nature of rights, about whether rights are absolute or can be traded, about how to resolve conflicts between liberty and welfare, and the liberal paradox remains one of the most important results in social choice theory, remains a challenge to liberal political philosophy. Imagine a specific example. Two people, call them Prude and Lude, and a book, and Prude prefers that no one read the book, finds it offensive, would be most satisfied if neither reads it. And second best for Prude is if Prude reads it rather than Lude reading it, because at least then Prude can argue against it from first-hand knowledge, and worst for Prude is if Lude reads it while Prude does not. And Lude has opposite preferences, most prefers that Prude read the book, because Lude thinks Prude needs liberalising. Second best for Lude is that Lude reads it, and worst is that neither reads it. And now apply minimal liberalism. Say that Prude should be decisive over whether Prude reads the book, should have the right to choose for themselves, and Lude should be decisive over whether Lude reads the book, and Prude chooses not to read, exercises their right, and Lude chooses to read, exercises their right, and the outcome is Prude does not read and Lude reads, but both prefer the outcome where Prude reads and Lude does not. Both rank that outcome higher, and so the liberal outcome, the outcome that respects individual rights, violates Pareto efficiency, produces an outcome that both prefer to avoid, and the paradox emerges, respecting rights produces an outcome that unanimous preferences reject. The liberal paradox demonstrates that rights and welfare can conflict, that giving individuals control over personal matters can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And this challenges the assumption that liberalism is coherent, that respecting freedom always improves welfare. And Sen's paradox shows that this is false, shows that freedom and welfare can diverge, that societies face trade-offs between respecting rights and respecting preferences, and different resolutions prioritize differently. Some prioritize rights and accept that Pareto improvements may be blocked, accept that unanimous preferences may be overridden by individual sovereignty, and other resolutions prioritize welfare and accept that rights may be violated when everyone would benefit, and neither resolution is fully satisfying. Both involve accepting tensions within liberal values. Visualize the paradox as revealing a cycle. Individual rights produce an outcome, unanimous preferences reject that outcome and prefer an alternative, but that alternative violates individual rights, and we are stuck cannot satisfy both rights and preferences simultaneously. And this cycle shows that liberalism contains contradictions, that its commitments can conflict, and resolving the conflict requires prioritizing, requires deciding whether rights or welfare is more fundamental, and different liberal theories answer differently. Rights-based liberalism prioritizes rights and accepts welfare losses. Welfare-based liberalism prioritizes welfare and accepts rights violations, and no theory satisfies both perfectly. One response to the liberal paradox argues that the problem is with the specification of rights, that the rights in Sen's example are meddlesome, are concerned with what others do, and proper rights are self-regarding, are concerned only with what you do, not with what others do. And if rights are limited to self-regarding matters, then the paradox may not arise. Then respecting rights may be compatible with Pareto efficiency. And this response requires distinguishing between self-regarding and other-regarding preferences, between preferences about your own life and preferences about others' lives. And liberalism protects the former, but not the latter. And this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of rights, by denying that Prude has a right to prevent Lude from reading, even if Prude prefers that outcome. Another response accepts the paradox, accepts that rights sometimes block Pareto improvements, and argues that this is acceptable, that rights are constraints on social choice, are not mere preferences to be aggregated, but are protections that cannot be violated, even for welfare gains. And this deontological response treats rights as absolute, as trumps over welfare, and accepts that respecting rights may produce outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And this response is consistent with rights-based liberalism, with the view that individual freedom is foundational, is not negotiable, and welfare considerations cannot override rights. And the paradox is accepted as showing the cost of rights, showing that freedom has trade-offs. A third response questions the Pareto principle, argues that unanimous preferences should not always be respected, that preference satisfaction is not always good. And in Sen's example, the preferences are meddlesome, are concerned with interfering in others' choices, and perhaps such preferences should not count, should not be given weight in social choice. And this response modifies the Pareto principle to exclude meddlesome preferences, to respect only preferences about self-regarding matters. And this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of preferences that matter for social choice. And this approach has some support, has intuitive appeal, because it seems wrong to let people's preferences about others' private behaviour determine social outcomes, seems to give too much weight to intolerance or judgment. The liberal paradox also connects to debates about paternalism, about whether societies should prevent people from making choices that harm themselves, and paternalism violates minimal liberalism, overrides individual choice for welfare reasons, and the paradox shows why such overriding might be tempting, shows that respecting choice can produce outcomes that the chooser prefers to avoid. And this creates pressure toward paternalism, toward intervention, but liberalism resists, maintains that individual choice must be respected even when it leads to regret. And the tension between respecting choice and promoting welfare is permanent, is built into liberal theory, and the paradox makes it explicit. Some argue that the liberal paradox is merely theoretical, is unlikely in practice, requires specific preference structures that rarely occur, and empirical investigation of whether such structures exist would be valuable, but regardless of frequency, the paradox is important as a logical possibility, as a demonstration that liberal principles can conflict. And this shows that liberalism requires trade-offs, requires balancing competing values, and political philosophy must grapple with these trade-offs rather than assuming that liberal values are always compatible. The paradox also raises questions about whether societies should recognize rights at all, whether individual sovereignty over personal matters is justified if it can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And consequentialists might use the paradox to argue against rights, to argue that social choice should be based on welfare alone, without constraints from individual rights. But most find this conclusion extreme, find that rights are valuable despite potential conflicts with welfare, and the challenge is to specify rights carefully, to balance rights and welfare, to create institutions that respect both as much as possible while recognizing that perfect compatibility is impossible. Prude and Lude exercise their rights, make their choices, and the outcome satisfies liberal principles but violates Pareto efficiency, and both prefer an alternative, but that alternative requires violating someone's rights, requires overriding someone's choice, and the paradox stands unresolved, showing that liberalism contains tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that rights and preferences can diverge, and the liberal paradox endures as one of the important impossibility results in social choice theory, as a challenge to liberal political philosophy, as a demonstration that liberal values are not perfectly compatible. And the paradox remains a permanent feature of liberal theory, requiring careful navigation, requiring trade-offs between competing values, and showing that coherent liberalism is more complex than it appears. The Monty Hall problem. A game show host presents 3 doors. Behind one is a valuable prize, a car perhaps, and behind the other 2 are less desirable outcomes, goats or some other consolation, and the contestant chooses a door, say, door number 1, but before the chosen door is opened, the host, who knows what is behind each door, opens one of the other doors, revealing a goat, and now 2 doors remain closed. The one the contestant originally chose, and one other, and the host offers a choice: stick with the original selection or switch to the other unopened door, and the question that has baffled and frustrated countless people is simple. Does it matter? Is there an advantage to switching? And the answer, counterintuitive as it seems, is yes. Switching doubles the probability of winning, changing the odds from 1 in 3 to 2 in 3. And this result violates most people's intuitions. Seems wrong? Feels like it cannot be right? Yet it is mathematically certain. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of the American television game show Let's Make a Deal, a puzzle in probability that reveals how poorly human intuition handles conditional probability and how easily we can be misled by seemingly simple scenarios. The reasoning behind the correct answer goes as follows. When the contestant first chooses a door, the probability that the prize is behind that door is 1 in 3, and the probability that it is behind one of the other 2 doors is 2 in 3. And this much is uncontroversial. But when the host opens one of the other doors and reveals a goat, showing that the prize is not behind that door, the probabilities do not redistribute evenly among the remaining doors. The original choice still has a 1 in 3 probability of being correct because the host's action did not change the fact that the contestant's initial choice was made with 1 in 3 odds. But the other unopened door now has a 2 in 3 probability because the 2 in 3 chance that was distributed across the 2 unchosen doors is now concentrated in the single remaining door, and so switching to that door doubles the chance of winning. The intuition that misleads most people is the idea that once one door is opened and eliminated, there are 2 doors left, and the prize is equally likely to be behind either, giving a 50-50 chance regardless of whether you switch. But this reasoning ignores the information provided by the host's action, the fact that the host deliberately chose to open a door with a goat. And this deliberate choice is not random, it is constrained by knowledge. The host cannot open the door with the prize and will not open the door the contestant chose. And so the host's action provides information that updates the probabilities in a non-obvious way. A useful way to see why switching is advantageous is to imagine a version of the game with 1,000,000 doors. The contestant chooses one door, which has a 1 in a million chance of having the prize, and then the host opens 999,998 of the other doors, all showing goats, leaving only the contestant's original choice and one other door. And now it seems clear that the contestant's original choice, made with 1 in a million odds, is almost certainly wrong. And the remaining door, the one the host carefully avoided opening, is almost certainly the one with the prize, and switching gives a 999,999 in a million chance of winning. And the same principle applies with 3 doors, just with less dramatic numbers. The Monty Hall problem has been a source of controversy and heated debate, even among mathematicians and statisticians. And when Marilyn Vos Savant, a columnist known for her high IQ, published the correct answer in her magazine column in 1990, she received thousands of letters, many from PhD holders and professionals, insisting she was wrong. And the controversy revealed how deeply counterintuitive the solution is, how resistant people are to accepting it even when presented with mathematical proof. And this resistance reflects broader features of human cognition. The tendency to rely on heuristics and intuitions that work well in most everyday situations, but fail in probabilistic scenarios involving conditional information. The problem also illustrates the importance of conditioning in probability, the fact that probabilities must be updated in light of new information, and that the way information is acquired matters. The host's knowledge and deliberate choice of which door to open is crucial to the solution. If the host opened a door randomly and happened to reveal a goat, then the probabilities would indeed be 50-50. But because the host knows and deliberately avoids the prize door, the situation is different. And this distinction between random and informed selection is subtle and easy to miss. The Monty Hall problem has applications beyond game shows. It appears in medical testing, in legal reasoning, in machine learning, anywhere that probabilities must be updated based on partial information. And understanding the logic of the Monty Hall problem helps clarify how to reason correctly in these more consequential contexts, how to avoid fallacies, how to properly incorporate evidence into probability assessments. The problem also raises questions about the psychology of probability, about why people find certain probabilistic reasoning so difficult. And experiments have shown that even after being told the correct answer and shown simulations that demonstrate it, many people remain skeptical, unable to shake the intuition that switching makes no difference. And this persistence of false intuition, despite evidence, suggests that probabilistic thinking is not natural to humans, that we evolved in environments where simple heuristics like equiprobability were sufficient, and that the kind of careful conditional reasoning required by the Monty Hall problem is a learned skill that requires training and practice. The doors stand closed, one hides the prize, the host knows which. The contestant chooses. The host opens a door, reveals a goat, and offers the choice. And the decision, which seems inconsequential, which feels like a coin flip, is actually a test of probabilistic reasoning, a puzzle that most people get wrong, that defies intuition, that reveals the gap between how we think probability works and how it actually works. And the Monty Hall problem endures, a staple of probability courses, a cautionary tale about trusting intuition, a reminder that the world is full of situations where the obvious answer is wrong, where careful analysis reveals unexpected structure, where what seems like chance is actually determined by hidden information, and the contestant who switches, who overcomes intuition and follows the mathematics, walks away with the prize twice as often, and the contestant who sticks with the original choice, trusting gut instinct, wins only a third of the time. And the difference, the doubling of odds, is not a trick or a gimmick, but a genuine feature of how conditional probability operates, and the problem persists, puzzling new generations, frustrating those who encounter it, illuminating those who understand it. A small puzzle with large implications. A game show scenario that contains lessons about reasoning, evidence, and the limits of human intuition. The ontological paradox, why existence itself is impossible. A philosopher asks the most fundamental question in metaphysics, asks why anything exists at all, why there is something rather than nothing, and this question seems to demand an answer. Seems like there must be some explanation for the existence of the universe, some reason why being triumphs over non-being, and yet every proposed answer creates problems, creates paradoxes, leads to infinite regress or unjustified stopping points. And this is the ontological paradox, the puzzle about existence itself, about whether existence requires explanation, whether existence can be explained, whether there could be a sufficient reason for there being something rather than nothing. And the paradox arises because existence seems to be a brute fact, seems to be something that just is without explanation, and yet accepting brute facts seems unsatisfying, seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation. And this tension between the demand for explanation and the impossibility of ultimate explanation creates the ontological paradox, a paradox that has troubled philosophers since ancient times, that remains unresolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, and that reveals deep limits on human understanding, on our capacity to explain why things are rather than why they are not. Imagine trying to explain why the universe exists, why there is something rather than nothing, and you might say the universe exists because it was created, but then you must explain why the creator exists. And if you say the creator exists necessarily, exists by its own nature, cannot fail to exist, then you face the question of why necessary existence is possible, why there are any necessary beings, why the category of necessary existence is not empty. And if you say the creator has no explanation, exists as a brute fact, then you have abandoned the demand for explanation, have accepted that existence requires no reason. And if existence requires no reason, then why not say the universe itself exists as a brute fact? Why invoke a creator at all, and the explanatory chain either goes on forever, infinite regress, or stops at something unexplained? Brute fact, and neither option is satisfying. Neither provides the ultimate explanation we were seeking, and the ontological paradox emerges, the recognition that existence cannot be fully explained, that the question why something rather than nothing has no satisfactory answer. The paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. Either everything has an explanation, or some things are brute facts without explanation. If everything has an explanation, then there must be an explanation for the totality of all facts, for why anything exists at all. And this explanation must appeal to something outside the totality, something that explains why the totality exists. But nothing is outside the totality. The totality includes everything, and so there can be no explanation for the totality, and so not everything has an explanation. And there are brute facts, and if there are brute facts, then the principle of sufficient reason is false, and we must accept that some things exist without reason, without explanation, and if existence requires no explanation, then the question why something rather than nothing has no answer is not a real question, is based on the false assumption that existence requires explanation. Visualize nothingness, absolute nothingness, no matter, no energy, no space, no time, no laws of nature, no mathematical structures, no abstract objects, nothing at all, and from this nothingness, something emerges. The universe comes into being, and the question is why? What caused this emergence? What explained this transition from nothing to something? And the problem is that causes and explanations presuppose existence, presuppose that there are things that can cause and explain. And absolute nothingness contains no causes, no explanations, nothing that could produce something. And so the emergence from nothing seems impossible, seems to violate principles of causation and explanation. And yet here we are. Existence is actual. Something exists. And this existence seems inexplicable, seems to be a brute fact that cannot be explained in terms of anything more fundamental, because there is nothing more fundamental than existence itself. One response to the ontological paradox accepts it, accepts that existence is a brute fact, that there is no explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, that the universe just exists without reason. And this response abandons the principle of sufficient reason, abandons the demand that everything be explained, and treats existence as the foundation, as the starting point beyond which explanation cannot go. And this response is common among atheist philosophers, among those who see the universe as all there is, as existing without creator or external explanation. And the ontological paradox is dissolved by rejecting one of its premises, by denying that existence requires explanation. Another response appeals to necessary existence, argues that something must exist, that nothingness is not a genuine possibility, that existence is necessary, and the question why something rather than nothing is based on the false assumption that nothing is a real alternative. and various arguments have been offered for necessary existence. Arguments that nothingness is unstable, that something must arise from nothing due to quantum fluctuations or logical necessity, or arguments that necessary beings like God exist by their nature and cannot fail to exist. And these arguments attempt to show that existence is not contingent, not dependent on external factors, but is necessary, is unavoidable. And if existence is necessary, then the question why something rather than nothing dissolves. The answer is that something must exist. Nothing is not an option. A third response questions the question, argues that why is there something rather than nothing is not a genuine question, is based on confusion about what questions can meaningfully be asked. And the question presupposes that nothing is the default, the expected state, and something is the deviation that requires explanation. But this presupposition is unjustified. There is no reason to privilege nothing over something, no reason to think nothing is more natural or more likely. And if something and nothing are on equal footing, then the question collapses, becomes unanswerable because it has no presupposition to support it. And the ontological paradox dissolves because the founding question is revealed to be pseudo-question. The ontological paradox also connects to debates about cosmology, about the origin of the universe, about whether the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, or whether something existed before, and cosmologists have proposed various scenarios. Eternal inflation, where universes are constantly being created in a multiverse. Cyclic cosmologies, where the universe goes through endless cycles of expansion and contraction. Quantum creation, where the universe emerged from quantum vacuum fluctuations, and each scenario pushes the question back, explains our universe in terms of something more fundamental. But the question remains why that more fundamental thing exists, why there is quantum vacuum, why there are laws of physics, why there is anything at all. And the ontological paradox persists at every level, cannot be escaped by postulating more fundamental entities or processes. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, treat it as revealing something deep about the limits of explanation, about the structure of understanding. That explanation must stop somewhere, must reach a foundation that is itself unexplained. And existence is that foundation, is the basic fact that grounds all other facts. And accepting this involves accepting that not everything can be explained, that the demand for total explanation is impossible to satisfy, and the ontological paradox is not a problem to solve, but a limit to accept, a recognition that human understanding has boundaries, that some questions have no answers, and the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is such a question, is beyond our capacity to answer. And we must live with the mystery, with the brute fact of existence. The universe exists, spreads across billions of light years, contains galaxies and stars and planets and life. And the question echoes, why? Why does any of this exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And no answer fully satisfies, no explanation reaches the ultimate ground. And the ontological paradox persists, ancient and insoluble. A paradox that reveals the limits of metaphysics, the boundaries of explanation, the point where philosophy must fall silent and accept that existence simply is, without reason, without cause, without ultimate explanation. And the paradox endures as one of the deepest problems in philosophy, a problem that perhaps cannot be solved because it points to the edge of what can be understood, the limit where explanation gives out and brute fact takes over, and existence remains, mysterious and fundamental, and the question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The paradox of confirmation. Why seeing a red apple proves all ravens are black. A scientist seeks to confirm the hypothesis that all ravens are black, and the obvious way to test this hypothesis is to observe ravens, to find ravens and check their colour. And each black raven found provides evidence for the hypothesis, confirms it slightly, makes it more likely to be true. And this seems straightforward, seems like basic scientific method. Observe instances that match the hypothesis and they provide confirmation. But philosopher Carl Hempel noticed something strange, something that reveals how confirmation works in unexpected ways. And the strangeness begins with a logical equivalence. The statement, "all ravens are black," is logically equivalent to the statement, "all non-black things are non-ravens." These two statements have exactly the same truth conditions. If one is true, then the other must be true. If one is false, then the other must be false. And so anything that confirms one statement should confirm the other, should provide equal evidence for both. But now consider what confirms the statement. All non-black things are non-ravens, and observing a non-black non-raven should confirm it. Observing a red apple provides evidence that all non-black things are non-ravens because a red apple is non-black and is a non-raven. And since all non-black things are non-ravens is equivalent to all ravens are black, observing a red apple should confirm that all ravens are black. And this seems absurd, seems like observing apples in your kitchen has nothing to do with the colour of ravens. And yet the logic is impeccable, and this is the paradox of confirmation, also called Hempel's paradox or the Raven paradox. A puzzle about how evidence works, about what confirms scientific hypotheses, and about whether our intuitions about confirmation can be trusted. Imagine a scientist sitting in a laboratory surrounded by red apples, carefully noting each one, recording that it is red and not a raven, and claiming that this investigation provides evidence about ravens, evidence that all ravens are black. And this seems ridiculous. Seems like the scientist has confused what is relevant to the hypothesis, has mistaken irrelevant observations for genuine evidence, and yet the logical structure is clear. Each red apple confirms that all non-black things are non-ravens, and this statement is logically equivalent to all ravens are black. And confirmation should be closed under logical equivalence. If observation O confirms hypothesis H, and H is equivalent to H, then O should confirm H out, otherwise confirmation would depend on how we phrase hypotheses rather than on what they say. And so the scientist with the red apples is doing legitimate science, is confirming a hypothesis about ravens even though no ravens are involved. And the paradox forces us to either accept this counterintuitive conclusion or reject some principle we thought was obvious about how confirmation works. The paradox reveals tension between formal logic and intuitive judgment. Because formally the argument is valid, red apples do confirm that all ravens are black through the equivalence with all non-black things are non-ravens, but intuitively this seems wrong. Seems like red apples are irrelevant to ravens, and resolving this tension requires either explaining why the formal conclusion is actually correct and our intuitions are misleading, or showing where the formal argument goes wrong, where a principle we thought was valid actually fails. And both options have been pursued, have generated extensive philosophical literature, have produced multiple proposed solutions, none of which has won universal acceptance. Visualize the logical space of all objects, divided into 4 categories: black ravens, which confirm the hypothesis directly; non-black ravens, which would falsify the hypothesis; black non-ravens like coal or blackboards, which seem irrelevant; and non-black non-ravens like red apples, which also seem irrelevant. And the paradox says that observing objects in the 4th category, non-black non-ravens, provides evidence for the hypothesis that all ravens are black, because these observations confirm the equivalent hypothesis that all non-black things are non-ravens, and each red apple, each green leaf, each blue car provides a tiny bit of evidence that ravens are black. And while this sounds absurd, it follows from principles of confirmation that seem undeniable. One proposed solution appeals to background knowledge and prior probabilities, argues that red apples do confirm that all ravens are black, but the confirmation is so tiny as to be practically negligible. Because we have vast background knowledge about the number of non-black things in the universe, we know there are billions and billions of non-black objects, and observing one red apple increases our confidence that all non-black things are non-ravens by an infinitesimal amount, whereas we have much less background knowledge about ravens, and observing one black raven increases our confidence that all ravens are black by a larger amount, and so both observations provide confirmation, but in vastly different degrees. And this explains why it seems pointless to observe red apples when investigating raven colour. Not because they provide no confirmation, but because they provide so little confirmation that the exercise is worthless. And this Bayesian solution preserves the formal logic while explaining the intuition, accepts that red apples confirm the hypothesis, but explains why we correctly ignore them. Another solution challenges the equivalence condition, argues that confirmation is not closed under logical equivalence, that logically equivalent statements can receive different confirmation from the same observation. And the reason is that confirmation depends not just on logical form, but on the way hypotheses are stated, on which predicates are used, on how the hypothesis carves up the world, and all ravens are black, and all non-black things are non-ravens, while logically equivalent organise the world differently, make different predicates primary, and observations confirm hypotheses relative to these organisations, and a black raven confirms the first hypothesis more than the second, and a red apple confirms the second more than the first, even though they are equivalent. And this solution rejects the principle that equivalent hypotheses must receive equal confirmation from the same observation. A third solution appeals to selective confirmation, argues that observing a red apple provides some evidence for all ravens are black, but only under certain conditions, only when the observation is made in a context where it has the potential to falsify the hypothesis, and seeing a red apple in your kitchen where you never expected to find a raven provides no confirmation, provides no new information, but seeing a red apple in a context where you might have found a non-black raven, where the observation had the potential to reveal a counterexample, does provide confirmation. And so confirmation depends not just on what is observed, but on the circumstances of observation, on what was at stake, on what alternatives were possible. And this solution ties confirmation to potential falsification, treats confirmation as depending on whether observations eliminate possibilities rather than merely matching hypotheses. The paradox also connects to the problem of induction, to Hume's problem of how we can justify inferring from observed instances to unobserved cases, because confirming all ravens are black by observing black ravens assumes that the future will resemble the past, that unobserved ravens will be like observed ravens, and this assumption itself cannot be justified without circularity. And the paradox adds another layer, shows that even if we accept induction, we face puzzles about what counts as confirming evidence, about whether observations of non-ravens can tell us about ravens, and these puzzles reveal that confirmation is more complex than it appears, cannot be reduced to simple pattern matching or accumulation of positive instances. The scientist with the red apples continues recording, carefully noting each observation, and the paradox hangs over the investigation, a question about whether this absurd procedure is actually legitimate science, whether red apples really do provide evidence about ravens, and the answer depends on how we understand confirmation, on which principles we accept, on whether we follow formal logic or intuitive judgment, and the paradox remains unresolved in the sense that different solutions appeal to different intuitions, make different trade-offs, and no consensus has emerged, only a recognition that confirmation is subtle, that evidence works in non-obvious ways, that formal principles can lead to counterintuitive conclusions, and that the relationship between observation and theory, between data and hypothesis, between evidence and confirmation, is more complex than common sense suggests, and Hempel's paradox endures as a classic problem in philosophy of science, a puzzle that continues to challenge our understanding of scientific method, a reminder that even basic concepts like confirmation and evidence conceal difficulties that philosophy has not fully resolved.